They won't even look at me. That was the first thought that crossed my mind as I stepped through the double doors of the county courthouse at 8:57 a.m. The chill of the early winter morning still clung to my coat. The fluorescent hallway lights buzzed faintly above, casting a pale, flat glow over everything, like a stage before the play begins. My heels clicked against the polished tile floor, echoing in the long corridor as if each step were announcing something they hadn't yet understood. They thought I'd stay silent. But Grandma's records told the story they tried to bury. Don't miss a second of this. My parents stood near the wooden bench outside courtroom 3B, dressed in their Sunday best. My mother's pearls were perfectly aligned, and my father's navy suit was pressed within an inch of its life. Their lawyer, a younger man with too much gel in his hair, whispered something to them. All three laughed softly. The sound carried, not because it was loud but because it was cruel. They didn't look at me. Not once. I paused for a moment at the end of the hallway. I had expected nerves. Shaking hands maybe. But what I felt instead was stillness. A cold, centered calm that came from months of preparation, and from one thing they didn't know I had. My gloved hand tightened slightly around the worn leather folder tucked beneath my arm. It wasn't heavy, but its presence was grounding. Like a hand on my shoulder. Like Grandma was still there, whispering, "Let them underestimate you." I walked toward them slowly, deliberately. My mother finally glanced up. Her eyes flicked over me like I was a stranger passing by on the street. Then she looked away. "She came," my father muttered, not even lowering his voice. Their lawyer smirked. "Of course she did. She has to." They turned their backs to me and resumed whispering. It wasn't just disrespect. It was dismissal. The same kind I'd felt since I was a little girl. Being talked over, ignored at family dinners, forgotten on birthdays. To them I had always been background noise. But not today. The courtroom doors opened with a low creak. The bailiff called for both parties. My parents walked in first, their heads held high, whispering last-minute strategies. I followed a few paces behind, letting the wooden doors swing wide, framing me in the morning light that spilled through the hallway windows. 9 a.m. sharp. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor echoed sharply before settling into silence. I took my seat at the right side of the courtroom opposite my parents. Their lawyer spread his papers across the table like a man about to perform a well-rehearsed magic trick. As he leaned toward my parents, my gaze caught something small but telling. A faint tremor in my mother's hands as she adjusted her pearls. She had always done that when she was nervous. She thought no one noticed. I noticed. The judge called the case. Thompson versus Thompson. My maiden name. Hearing it spoken like that, as if I were a stranger to my own family, sent a cold ripple through me. Their lawyer stood immediately, launching into his opening statement with smooth, confident tones. He painted a picture of a vulnerable elderly couple, manipulated by their estranged daughter for financial gain. His words were crafted to sound almost tender, but beneath the surface they were knives. I watched the jury, 6 men, 6 women, as their faces softened slightly at phrases like betrayal of trust and family torn apart. He was good. Too good. I didn't interrupt. I didn't shift in my chair. I simply rested my hands on the leather folder in my lap. Inside it, beneath the layers of official documents, transcripts, and sealed envelopes, was something they had no idea existed. Something that had been quietly waiting for this very moment. I glanced toward the large clock mounted on the wall above the judge. The second hand ticked steadily. Almost time, I thought. While he spoke, my mind drifted back, not to childhood but to 6 months earlier, sitting beside Grandma's bed in the quiet of the nursing home. She had looked at me with clear, unwavering eyes. "They think I'm forgetful," she had whispered. "They think I don't see what they ask for. What they take. But I do. And I write everything down." Her thin fingers had tapped the leather folder as if it were a treasure chest. One day this will speak louder than I can. Back in the courtroom, my parents were nodding along with their lawyer, playing the part of wounded victims. My father occasionally dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief, though no actual tears came. My mother pressed her lips together in a perfect display of quiet suffering. They were good performers. Years of family gatherings had taught them how to pretend. The smell of old wood and coffee lingered in the air. The bailiff shifted on his feet near the door. A few reporters scribbled in notepads at the back of the room. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, giving the whole space a sterile, almost theatrical quality. My lawyer leaned in slightly. "You ready?" he whispered. I nodded. I wasn't just ready. I had been waiting. The lawyer wrapped up his opening, ending with, "She isolated her grandmother in her final years and pressured her into altering her will in her favor. We intend to prove this pattern of manipulation clearly and decisively." The judge turned to me. "Defense." My lawyer rose smoothly. "Will respond in full, Your Honor." As he began, I allowed my eyes to wander to my parents again. That's when I caught it, a brief, nervous glance between them. Not long. Just a flicker. But I'd grown up watching those looks. It meant they were worried about something being exposed. Something they assumed no one else remembered. The hidden advantage sat quietly in my lap. The judge called for a short recess after opening statements. As everyone stood, I noticed my parents' lawyer lean in and whisper something urgent. My father's jaw tightened. My mother touched her necklace again. I stood slowly, adjusted my coat and walked out into the hallway. The cold air from the vent hit my face. Across the hall, my parents huddled with their lawyer. They didn't look at me once. "Do you think she knows?" I heard my father whisper harshly. "She can't," their lawyer replied. "We've controlled this narrative for months." I didn't stop walking. But inside, something sharp and quiet settled into place. As I pushed open the heavy door to the restroom, another woman followed me in, an older lady from the jury pool. She stood at the sink, washing her hands, and gave me a brief, sympathetic look. "Families," she muttered, shaking her head. "They can be something else." I offered a small, calm smile. "Yes," I said softly. "They certainly can." When the recess ended, I walked back in and took my seat. The bailiff called for silence. My parents returned to their side, their smiles fixed, but the cracks were showing now. Their lawyer flipped nervously through his notes. The judge glanced at the clock. "Let's proceed." As my lawyer rose to continue, I placed the leather folder on the table. My hand rested on it gently. The faint scrape of leather against wood was loud enough for my mother to notice. Her eyes flicked down just for a second, and in that second I saw it. The realization. She recognized the folder. Her face went pale. She turned to my father, whispering something urgently. He tried to maintain his composure, but his fingers drummed the table faster now. Their lawyer shot them a quick, irritated look, as if telling them to hold it together. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The folder had done the talking for me. The judge called for witness introductions. Their lawyer prepared his stack of papers, unaware that every single one of his arguments would unravel piece by piece. The folder remained closed, but its presence shifted the air. Like thunder before a storm. I met my mother's eyes across the room. For the first time, she looked at me as if she truly saw me, not as the quiet daughter, not as the background figure, but as someone standing exactly where she didn't want me to be. I smiled. Not wide. Just enough to let her know I wasn't afraid. The courtroom fell quiet as the first witness was called. And in that silence I knew something she didn't. This wasn't their story anymore. It was mine. My mother's pale face lingered in my mind as the first witness was sworn in. Her eyes had flicked toward the folder, and something in her broke for just a moment. I didn't react outwardly. I sat still, my hands folded neatly on the table, listening to the shuffle of papers, the creak of chairs, and the faint humming of the heater overhead. The courtroom felt warmer now, but the air was thick, like everyone sensed a storm gathering, even if they couldn't see the lightning yet. Their lawyer rose with all the confidence of a man stepping onto a stage he believed he owned. He adjusted his tie, glanced at the jury with a practiced, sympathetic smile, and began questioning his first witness, a neighbor who had known my family for decades. She was in her 70s, wearing a neat floral blouse, her gray hair pinned tightly. "Mrs. Henderson," he said smoothly, "would you say the relationship between my clients and their daughter was strained?" She hesitated briefly, glancing toward me. "Well, yes, I suppose so. They weren't very close." "And would you say that toward the end of her life their mother, the deceased, spent less time with them and more time with the defendant?" "She did spend a lot of time with her granddaughter, yes," Mrs. Henderson replied, hands folded tightly. "But I just thought she liked the company." He nodded as if guiding her to an answer. Did you ever notice anything unusual? Any changes in the grandmother's behavior? Mrs. Henderson's brow furrowed. She seemed tired sometimes, but she was old. We're all tired. A few people in the jury chuckled softly. The lawyer leaned in slightly. Would you say the defendant encouraged distance between her grandmother and the rest of the family? I can't say for sure, she said. I don't like to assume. He smiled like a man who already had the answer. But would you agree that the relationship between my clients and their mother became more distant? She shifted in her seat, uncomfortable. Maybe. But I thought that was their doing, not hers. The lawyer's smile faltered briefly. He recovered quickly, thanked her and dismissed her. But the unease lingered. Mrs. Henderson had been polite, but her hesitation had cracked the smooth narrative he was trying to build. My lawyer gave me a small nod. Let him talk himself into a corner. Their lawyer moved on to his second witness, my cousin Lydia, the family gossip, always eager for attention. She entered the room in a bright pink sweater, acting like this was some afternoon television show. She leaned into the microphone. I just think it's so sad, she began dramatically, how she cut everyone off. She, the lawyer prompted. She, Lydia confirmed, tilting her head toward me with a look of manufactured pity. She started spending every day with Grandma. She controlled who visited, who didn't. Even I wasn't allowed in sometimes. That was a lie. I had asked Lydia not to come one night because Grandma was exhausted and needed rest. Lydia had shown up unannounced with her loud friends and cheap wine. Grandma had cried after she left. And would you say she became possessive? The lawyer asked. Oh, absolutely, Lydia said eagerly. She'd say, Grandma needs rest, or not today. Like she owned the house. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Lydia's words painted me as controlling, carefully chosen phrases, half-truths spun into something uglier. My chest tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. I'd known Lydia my entire life. She lied like other people breathed. Then the lawyer leaned in. Do you think Grandma was capable of making independent financial decisions toward the end of her life? Lydia pursed her lips. I don't know. She was old. She trusted people too easily. Especially her, she said, pointing at me like a schoolteacher catching a child. My lawyer immediately objected. Speculation. Sustained, the judge said firmly. The lawyer backed off, but Lydia had already planted the seed. I could see a few jurors exchange quiet looks. The narrative was being woven carefully, thread by thread, around the image of me as a manipulative, controlling granddaughter. As witness after witness spoke, a pattern emerged. None of them had real evidence. Just impressions. Hints. Half-remembered moments twisted through hearsay. It was polished, deceptively so. Like a house with perfect paint hiding cracks beneath the walls. I let it continue. I didn't flinch when my father took the stand and called me distant, growing up. I didn't blink when my mother wiped at fake tears, saying she just didn't understand why her daughter would isolate her grandmother like that. Every word was rehearsed. Smooth. Designed to make me seem like the problem. But I had something they didn't. The truth, documented in Grandma's own careful handwriting and recordings. The box sat quietly beneath the table, a plain steel container with a faded brass lock. I could almost feel it humming beneath my feet. It wasn't time yet. Not quite. During the lunch recess, I sat alone in the small cafeteria across the street, stirring my coffee slowly. The steam curled upward like smoke. A few people whispered nearby, clearly locals who had wandered into the trial out of curiosity. One woman said, "She doesn't look manipulative." The man beside her shrugged. "They always look normal." I took a slow sip. I had learned to live with whispers. What mattered wasn't what strangers believed at noon. It was what they'd believe by 4 p.m. When court resumed, their lawyer strutted back in with renewed energy, stacking his papers dramatically. He called a handwriting expert, claiming Grandma's will had irregularities. The expert pointed out 2 minor variations in Grandma's signature. My lawyer objected immediately. Grandma's arthritis had been well documented. The judge allowed the testimony but instructed the jury to weigh it carefully. By 3:15 p.m., their lawyer stood before the jury with his closing remarks for the day. His voice softened, dripping with artificial empathy. "All we ask," he said, "is that you look at the facts and see the pattern. A vulnerable woman. A distant family. A granddaughter who suddenly became very close. And then inherited everything. It doesn't take much to connect the dots. He ended with a long, deliberate pause, letting the weight of his insinuations settle like dust in the air. My lawyer rose. Your Honor, he said calmly, before we respond we have something to present. The judge nodded. Proceed. I stood. Fully. Deliberately. The wood of the chair creaked softly. The room quieted. I reached under the table and pulled out the steel box. It was heavier than the folder, cool against my palms. As I set it on the table, the thunk of metal against wood echoed through the courtroom like a distant drum. My parents stiffened. Their lawyer's smile flickered. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The click was sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. Heads turned. Even the jury leaned forward slightly. I didn't open it yet. I just left it there, unlocked. My grandmother, I began, my voice steady, wasn't easily manipulated. She may have been old, but she wasn't naive. And she kept records, meticulous records, of everything that happened in her house. The lawyer tried to interrupt. Objection, narrative. The judge held up a hand. Overruled. Continue. I placed my hand on the lid. Inside this box are documents, letters and recordings in her handwriting and her voice. Dates, times, details. My mother whispered something urgently to my father. He paled. The lawyer's confident posture faltered. I looked at the jury one by one. You've heard a lot of polished stories today. But stories without proof are just that, stories. What's inside this box isn't a story. It's evidence. I lifted the lid slowly. The scent of old paper and metal filled the air. Dozens of envelopes, folders, and cassette tapes were stacked neatly, each labeled in Grandma's handwriting. The lawyer sputtered. We weren't informed of this evidence. It was submitted months ago during discovery, my lawyer said coolly. The judge raised an eyebrow. Counselor, perhaps you should review your own filings. Laughter rippled faintly through the courtroom. I reached in and pulled out the first envelope, sealed with Grandma's distinctive cursive, July 14th, loan request number 1. I didn't read it yet. I just held it up. This is where we start. The jury leaned in. The air changed. All the smooth lies that had filled the room for hours began to feel thin, fragile, breakable. And for the first time all day it was their lawyer who looked nervous. I held the envelope steady in my hands. The weight of it wasn't in the paper. It was in what it represented. Years of whispered demands, quiet manipulations, and hidden transactions were about to speak for themselves. I glanced at the jury. 12 pairs of eyes locked on me, curious now, no longer lulled by the polished lies they'd been fed all morning. My parents shifted uneasily at their table. Their lawyer pretended to shuffle papers, but his hands were stiff, betraying the panic he tried to hide. I broke the seal on the envelope with a deliberate tear. The sound was sharp in the silent courtroom. This, I said evenly, holding up the folded paper, was written by my father to my grandmother on July 14th. I unfolded it slowly, letting the old paper crackle. Grandma had always used her favorite stationery, pale cream with a faint lavender scent. Even after months in storage, the smell lingered, soft but distinct. Mom, I began reading, we're in a tight spot again. The house needs urgent repairs and we don't have the cash. If you could help us out, just this once, we promise we'll pay it back quickly. I looked up briefly. My father's jaw clenched. We hate to ask, but you're the only one we can rely on. Love, Tom. I folded the letter neatly and placed it on the table beside the box. There were 11 more like this, I said. All with similar wording. All signed by my parents. All filed by my grandmother in chronological order. The judge leaned forward slightly intrigued. The jury shifted again, their expressions tightening. Their lawyer stood quickly. Your Honor, these are just family letters. My lawyer cut him off smoothly. Family letters that correspond to dated bank withdrawals made by the deceased. We'll get to those. The lawyer sank back into his chair, lips pressed thin. I pulled out the next item. A small cassette tape in a plastic sleeve, labeled in Grandma's handwriting, October 3rd, phone call. Grandma didn't have a smartphone, I explained. But she did have a little handheld recorder. She used it for reminders, but occasionally, She recorded calls she thought were important. I held the recorder up. This is one of them. The bailiff brought a small speaker to the table. My lawyer pressed play. A burst of static, then Grandma's gentle voice. Hello? Then my mother's voice, clear and almost syrupy. Hi, Mom. I know it's late, but we need a big favor. It's just temporary. Tom's bonus hasn't come through yet. Could you wire us $25,000 first thing tomorrow? The jury's faces tightened. A few eyebrows lifted. Grandma's voice was steady. That's a lot of money, honey. My mother laughed lightly. You've always helped us. We'll make it up to you. Promise. End of recording. I pressed pause and set the recorder down. The silence that followed was heavier than before. My parents stared at the table, avoiding eye contact with the jury. Their lawyer cleared his throat nervously. I took out another tape. November 8th. Driveway conversation. This time it wasn't a phone call. It was Grandma's hidden little recorder in her cardigan pocket. My father's voice echoed through the room. Mom, come on. You can change the will later. Just make sure the house is in our name first. It'll make everything simpler. My breath caught slightly even though I'd heard this recording dozens of times before. The casual way he'd said it still stung. The courtroom was dead quiet. You could hear the faint buzz of the ceiling lights, the shifting of jurors in their seats, even the creak of the judge leaning back. I looked at my father. For the first time since the trial started, he couldn't look back at me. Piece by piece I laid out the evidence. Letters, recordings, notes. Grandma's handwriting was consistent, her dates precise. She documented every favor, every promise, every manipulation. And with each word I read or played, the polished narrative my parents had spent months constructing began to fracture. Their lawyer tried to object occasionally, but his voice lacked the earlier bravado. He stumbled over procedural rules, mixed up dates, and earned several sharp reprimands from the judge. By the fourth recording, a woman on the jury leaned forward with her chin resting on her hand, utterly engrossed. Another juror, a man in his 60s with silver hair, shook his head slowly at my father's voice on the tape. I felt a strange mix of emotions stirring inside me. Anger, yes, but also a deep ache. These were my parents. The people who had raised me, ignored me, and now tried to paint me as the villain. Hearing their voices played back like this, stripped of pretense, was both vindicating and heartbreaking. At one point my mother whispered something harshly to their lawyer, her voice barely audible. He whispered back urgently, but she shook her head and crossed her arms tightly. The judge called for a brief 10-minute recess. I stepped into the hallway, exhaling slowly. My hands were steady, but my heart beat hard against my ribs. Two women from the gallery, strangers, approached me gently. One of them, maybe in her 70s, put a hand over her heart. "Honey," she said softly, "that was brave." I didn't quite know how to respond. I nodded politely. "Thank you." When we returned to the courtroom, my lawyer pulled out Grandma's personal ledger. A thick, spiral-bound notebook filled with neat, looping handwriting. "This," he told the court, "is where the deceased logged every visit, every phone call, and every financial transaction related to her children. It spans 12 years. He flipped it open to a random page. October 5th. Tom asked for $15K again. Promised it's the last time. He said that last month too. I gave it. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. But I don't want to fight. My throat tightened reading that line silently. I remembered that fall vividly. Grandma had seemed tired all the time. Now I knew why. We presented page after page, each matching dates with bank statements and letters. There was no ambiguity left. The defense table grew quieter with every passing minute. My parents' lawyer stopped objecting entirely. He sat stiffly, eyes flicking nervously between the judge and the jury. Then came a moment I didn't expect. When we reached a particular recording, one from late December, Grandma's voice trembled. She spoke into the recorder alone in her living room. "I'm starting to wonder if they love me or just what I give them. But I write it all down. One day this will make sense." My breath caught. I hadn't listened to that one since the night I found it. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes. I blinked them away quickly, but the jury noticed. It wasn't a performance. It was real. The judge's expression softened slightly, though he remained composed. The jury leaned in closer than ever. One by one we let Grandma's words speak. Not my interpretations, not my accusations. Her voice. Her pen. Her truth. By the end of the afternoon, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted completely. When the judge called for the end of the day's session, the jury stood slowly, still absorbing what they'd heard. As I packed up the evidence, I caught my father staring at the box. His face was pale, his lips pressed together. My mother reached for his arm, but he pulled it away. They were unraveling. Not with a scream. Not with a dramatic outburst. But quietly, under the weight of their own words. Every letter. Every recording. Every entry in that ledger. Each one was a nail. And together they were building a coffin they'd made themselves. They were unraveling. Not with a scream. Not with a dramatic outburst. But quietly, under the weight of their own words. And I wasn't done. The judge called the court back into session after a brief recess. The bailiff's voice echoed through the room as people shuffled back to their seats. There was a new kind of energy hanging in the air now, not the smug confidence that had filled the morning, but a quiet anticipation. Like everyone knew something irreversible had begun. My parents returned to their table separately. They didn't walk in together as they had that morning. My father avoided my mother's gaze. My mother stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched near her temples. Their lawyer whispered something urgently to both of them, but they didn't respond in unison anymore. The judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Counsel," he said to their lawyer, "you may proceed with any rebuttal." Their lawyer stood, but the rhythm that had carried him earlier was gone. His papers were in disarray, a corner bent where his hand had gripped too tightly. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his voice less smooth now, I believe there may be explanations for these documents." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Then I suggest you offer them." He stumbled through a half-formed argument about family misunderstandings, financial confusion, and elderly misinterpretations. It was vague. Thin. Like wallpaper peeling from a damp wall. My lawyer waited patiently. When the judge gave him the floor, he didn't waste time. He rose slowly, like a man who knew gravity was on his side. "Your Honor," he began, "my client's parents have told a story, one that relied on sentiment, suggestion, and the hope that evidence didn't exist. But it does. And today their story falls apart." He turned to me and nodded. This was the moment to tighten the net. We began methodically. Bank statements that aligned with letters. Witness testimony cross-checked with dates from Grandma's ledger. Every line was like a hammer hitting a loose nail, driving it deeper. Their lawyer tried to object, irrelevant, misleading, speculative, but the judge overruled each one. My lawyer didn't just counter. He dismantled their points calmly, piece by piece, showing the jury the paper trail Grandma had left behind. I watched my parents closely. My father's hands fidgeted constantly now, adjusting his cufflinks, folding and unfolding his handkerchief. My mother kept glancing toward the jury, her expression shifting between feigned sorrow and barely contained panic. Then the judge leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Thompson," he said to my father, "I'd like to hear from you directly. Please take the stand." My father froze for half a second. Then he stood stiffly and made his way to the witness stand. The bailiff swore him in. My lawyer stepped forward. His tone was polite but firm. "Mr. Thompson," he began, "you've testified that your daughter manipulated her grandmother. Is that correct?" "Yes," my father said. His voice was steady at first. "She isolated her. Changed everything. We didn't even know the will had been updated." My lawyer nodded calmly. "And yet," he said, holding up a letter, "this is your handwriting dated March 2nd, asking for $15,000 for a temporary shortfall, correct?" My father squinted at the paper. Yes, that's mine. But that was just family business." "Of course," my lawyer replied. "And this audio recording," he pressed play on a small clip, "where you tell your mother to just sign the deed now and fix the will later, was that also family business?" The sound of my father's own voice filled the courtroom again. His eyes darted nervously. "I didn't mean it like that," he muttered. My lawyer tilted his head. "How did you mean it then?" Silence. The jury's faces hardened. My father's confident posture slumped ever so slightly. Then my mother was called. She took the stand with a practiced sad face, but the timing was against her. The jurors had already heard too much. My lawyer questioned her gently but precisely. When asked about the $25,000 late-night phone call, she tried to laugh it off. It was just a casual conversation. But the laughter died quickly in the heavy silence. By late afternoon, their lawyer tried a desperate tactic. "Your Honor," he said, "this case is clearly tearing this family apart. Perhaps mediation would be better suited." The judge cut him off. "Counsel, your clients filed this lawsuit. We will see it through." I felt a steady pulse of something deep in my chest. Not triumph, not yet. But certainty. They had started this fight thinking I'd break. Instead, they were watching their carefully constructed wall crumble brick by brick. During a brief recess, I stepped into the hallway. A reporter approached me cautiously. "Ma'am," she said, "I know you don't want to give statements, but can I ask, did you expect this to happen?" I met her gaze evenly. "I expected the truth to speak for itself," I replied. She nodded, scribbling in her notepad. Behind her, my parents huddled with their lawyer near the vending machines. They looked smaller than I'd ever seen them. My father's tie was loosened. My mother's lipstick had faded. They weren't strategizing anymore. They were reacting. When court resumed, my lawyer introduced a financial expert who had analyzed Grandma's bank activity. He spoke clearly, pointing out patterns. Regular withdrawals matching the letters, transfers to my parents' joint account, no evidence of coercion on my part. The jury listened intently. It wasn't flashy testimony. It was solid, measured, undeniable. Their lawyer tried to undermine the expert, asking convoluted questions about financial modeling. The expert calmly answered each one, making their lawyer look like he was grasping at straws. Then came something unexpected, a subtle but telling moment. During redirect, the expert mentioned almost casually, the deceased seemed meticulous. Every time she withdrew money for her children, she noted it down and often recorded follow-up conversations. It's rare to see records this organized. A murmur rippled through the jury. That casual observation was like a final nail hammered deeper. Grandma's habits weren't random, they were deliberate. As the day neared its end, the judge summarized what had been presented. Financial evidence, recorded conversations, written letters, ledger entries, and testimony. His tone was measured, but there was an unmistakable weight in his words. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will proceed with final statements and my ruling." My parents looked stunned. They had expected this trial to drag on, to intimidate me into settling, to make me fold. Instead, it was moving faster, because their case had no legs left to stand on. As the bailiff called the end of the session, I stood, gathering my papers slowly. My mother turned in her seat, catching my eye for the briefest moment. Her face was pale, but beneath the fear I saw something else, resentment. Not regret. Resentment. Didn't surprise me. Love had long ago been replaced by entitlement. I walked out of the courtroom ahead of them. This time they didn't follow close behind. They lagged, whispering urgently with their lawyer, their voices strained and sharp. Outside, the evening air was crisp, almost cold. The courthouse steps were bathed in the soft orange light of the setting sun. I paused for a moment, breathing it in. I thought of Grandma, her steady voice, her careful hands, the way she'd always written things down. She had given me the truth. I had simply opened the door and let it out. Tomorrow would bring the resolution. But today their fight had turned into their collapse. And tomorrow came. The morning of the verdict, the courthouse had a strange stillness to it. The usual chatter in the hallways was hushed, like everyone sensed we were approaching the end of something heavy. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly overhead, humming like a quiet drumbeat. My heels clicked slowly against the tile as I walked down the corridor toward courtroom 3B one last time. Inside, the air felt different. Not tense. Not hostile. Just waiting. The jury filed in one by one, their expressions solemn. Some held small notebooks, others clasped their hands. I recognized the woman who'd leaned forward during the recordings. She met my eyes briefly and gave the smallest nod. My parents sat side by side again, but the illusion of unity was gone. My father's tie was crooked. My mother's hair, always perfect, had a few stray strands near her temples. Their lawyer whispered to them urgently, but neither responded. Their faces had that pale, flat look people get when they've run out of stories to tell. The judge entered. "Court is in session." We stood, then sat. The bailiff handed the jury's decision to the judge. He read it silently, lips moving slightly, then set the papers down. "Before we proceed to the verdict," he said, "the defense may make a final statement." My lawyer nodded to me. This was it. I stood slowly. My knees didn't shake. My hands were steady. For months they had painted me as a manipulator. For years they had treated me like I was invisible. But now every word, every scrap of paper, every whisper from Grandma's careful recordings had led to this moment. I turned to the jury. "My parents believed this case would destroy me," I began, my voice clear and even. But it didn't. Because my grandmother was smarter than they ever realized. She wasn't confused. She wasn't coerced. She was meticulous. She documented the truth. "All I did was show it to you." I glanced at my parents. My mother stared at the floor. My father's jaw clenched, but he didn't meet my eyes. "I loved my grandmother," I continued. "She raised me when they were too busy to notice. She was the one who saw me when no one else did. And she trusted me, not because I asked for anything but because I never did. She made her choices freely. She left what she wanted to leave. This trial was never about me manipulating her. It was about them not accepting that her love didn't come with conditions." I paused, letting that sink in. "She left behind more than money. She left a record. She left the truth. And that's what I've shared with you." I sat down. My lawyer rested a hand briefly on my arm, not as reassurance but acknowledgement. The judge turned to the jury. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The forepersons stood. "We have, Your Honor." The room fell silent. Even the reporters lowered their pens for a moment. "In the case of Thompson versus Thompson," the foreperson read, "we find in favor of the defendant. A beat. We also recommend that the court consider sanctions for fraudulent claims and perjury." A low murmur spread through the courtroom. The judge nodded firmly. "This court finds the plaintiff's case to be without merit. Furthermore, the evidence suggests a pattern of deceit toward the deceased. Sanctions will be pursued in a separate hearing." My parents' lawyer slumped back in his chair. My mother pressed a hand to her chest. My father muttered something under his breath, something sharp but quiet. I didn't smile. "Not yet." The judge turned to me. "Miss Thompson," he said, his tone softer now, "your grandmother's documentation was exceptional. It spoke clearly. This court thanks you for presenting it with dignity." "Thank you, Your Honor," I replied. The gavel struck. "Case dismissed." The sound echoed through the courtroom like a final door closing. I stood. My parents didn't. They sat frozen as people began to file out. Reporters scribbling, onlookers whispering. A few jurors gave me small warm nods as they passed. As I gathered my things, their lawyer leaned toward them, whispering frantically. My father shoved the papers away. My mother's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't the kind that came from regret. They were the kind that came from losing. I walked toward the aisle. Halfway there, I heard my father's voice behind me. "You think this makes you better than us?" he hissed. I turned slowly. He was standing now, face flushed. My mother stayed seated, staring blankly ahead. "No," I said evenly. "It doesn't make me better. It just makes me free." His mouth opened, but nothing came out. I turned and kept walking. Outside, the air was crisp and clear, the morning sun just starting to warm the courthouse steps. Reporters crowded near the exit, microphones extended. I held up a hand. "No statements," I said calmly and kept moving. Halfway down the steps I paused. Across the street, the cafe where I'd sat alone during the recesses was open, steam fogging its windows. For months, that had been my quiet place to breathe between battles. But I didn't cross the street this time. I turned back and saw my parents emerge from the courthouse. They weren't together. My father walked ahead, his shoulders stiff. My mother followed a few paces behind, clutching her purse like it might hold everything slipping away from her. Their lawyer trailed behind them, his briefcase hanging low. They looked smaller than they ever had before. That was the twist Grandma had left behind. Not just the evidence but the timing. A week before she passed, she'd signed one last document, witnessed and notarized. It stated that if her estate were ever challenged under false claims, all secondary inheritance rights tied to those claims would be revoked. Quietly. Automatically. I hadn't mentioned it during the trial. There was no need. The court clerk handed that document to the judge moments after the verdict. I watched as my parents were called back toward the bench. Confusion rippled across their faces as the clerk explained what the document meant. Not only had they lost the case, they had lost everything they would have inherited from contingency clauses. Everything. Grandma had sealed their fate with the same quiet precision she'd used her whole life. As the realization sank in, my father's face turned ashen. My mother whispered, she wouldn't. But even she didn't sound convinced. The judge's voice carried across the room. The deceased's contingency clause is valid and enforceable. Secondary claims are revoked effective immediately. They had wanted a fight. They'd started a war. But Grandma had already written the ending long before the first shot was fired. I turned toward the street. A light breeze lifted the ends of my coat. For the first time in years, my steps felt light. I wasn't the quiet daughter standing behind them anymore. I was the one walking out first. And behind me, the empire they thought they controlled was already collapsing into dust. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. More powerful, emotional revenge stories, just like this, are waiting for you.